Director, and Mr. Ambassador, and our friends in Kyiv-Mohyla, particularly Konstantin Sigov, and friends and colleagues. I'm really very, very pleased to be here. I'm going to repeat what I said, I think, earlier this week at another occasion, that what I'm going to be talking about here and what Jose has been talking about is a set of ideas which is in full development. It's not finally clear. We're still struggling with some issues. And the principal way that we can move forward is to talk about these issues in a different context. We're always prisoners a little bit of our own context, and so we have a too narrow view, and when we speak about these analogous developments in another context, we get another angle on it. And so this is, for me, a very important experience here, and I'm very, very pleased to be here to talk about this. So what am I trying to do? Well, I'm trying to cast a little bit of light on what we mean by the term secular, at least in the way it's been used in starting off in the Western Academy in theories of secularization, because as we examine it, it's not entirely clear. It has a lot of fuzziness in it. And I want to look in a minute at 4 developments that have been considered to be processes of secularization. But before I get to that, I want to just make a linguistic remark about this term, secular. It's a Christian term. It's actually, I would think, a Latin Christian term. It comes from Latin Christendom in the particular use that it has. And what's interesting about it is that it's a term about time, about kinds of time. The seculum, it's the aeon in Greek, and viek in Slavonic, I think. In Ukrainian too, yeah. And so these words translate, but it began to have a particular use in Latin Christendom, which is the background to the word we're now using today. Although most people who use the word today in the West have no idea of this background. I think it's important to look briefly at it because, and I'll come back to that at the end when I try to look at some of the issues of lived experience which underlie the secular age and underlie reactions to the secular age. It's a term about time, about what kind of time? The seculum, the century. We're talking about ordinary, profane time, the time in which one thing happens after another. In contrast to what? Well, in Latin Christendom, or in all Christendoms, there's a contrast between our life in ordinary time and the relation to eternity, particularly eschatological relation to eternity. So it's time as against, if you like, eternity. And how it gets used in Latin Christendom is to look at different aspects of the society, aspects that have to do with its operation in ordinary time, its politics, its production, all these activities which are part of the secular dimension. And then there's something beyond the secular dimension, sometimes called spiritual, sometimes called internal, and so on, which is those aspects of the society that are related to this attempt to move towards eternity, to be related to eternity. So that's the beginning of the secular and its opposite, spiritual, religious split. But of course, in the original situation, this was thought of as what I want to call an internal binary. That is, a binary like things like left and right, left and right, up and down, where you can't instantiate one term without instantiating the other. If there's something on the right, there's something on the left. If there's something which is up, there has to be something which is down. And in the original use, the secular was one aspect of our society which also had another dimension, and there was no thought of using this term outside of this internal binary. The whole rise of the secular age could be understood perhaps as this. it takes that binary and makes it external. That is, where you can conceive of something being secular without anything being spiritual. Right? That is the meaning of, one very important meaning of the secular in the modern West, which means that it has to forget its origin. All right. So with that in mind, I'd like to look at 4 developments. Now, if we could have, which we begin to see here. There are, what does it mean to say that our society is secular? Well, there isn't a single clear answer to this question. People use the term secular, secularization. I've mentioned there, what does it mean to say that society is more secular than it was earlier, or that one society is more secular than another society? Surprisingly, there isn't a single development which answers this, but a kind of reference to Wittgenstein about, about definitions that have many strands which run through. I want to isolate 4 kinds of development which are used to judge, people are basing themselves on when they say this society is more secular than the next. So I guess we should jump to the next. Is that possible? Well, yeah, number 1 is, what people sometimes mean is that in this society, religious faith and or religious practice has declined. So that's what they mean by being more secular. Or else, we have another meaning where the society is called more secular because previously it had a religious or confessional definition. It was a Christian society, a Catholic society, a Muslim society, and it's now lost its definition. It's now considered, or that definition maybe is still there in some kind of theory, but it's faded very much from the scene and has very little importance. So that would be the second way of thinking about a society as secular. So let's maybe get the third. Now this is a lot more text here. Going back to our original sense of the secular, I said that there were certain activities in society which are very much those of people in the world, in history, who have to govern themselves, organize an economy, produce, and so on, right? And another development which is sometimes in people's minds when they say society is more secular now than before, is that a set of these activities that were always thought of as the secular aspect of society have taken on much greater importance. They take up much more space. And this is partly because they have been the site of increasing organization, increasing kinds of expertise, increasing complexifying administration. I mean, just think of the economy as people will have understood this, the set of productive activities and exchange in 1500. And the economy as we understand it today, made up of very large corporations, whole aspects of government trying to administer this, just very, very large swath of our lives are comprised in what we think of as the modern economy. In a sense, these areas of life, political administration, the economy, the world of art, the world of museums, the world of so on, has become, each of them, we'd like to think of it as a sphere. It's its own sphere, its own world. You can spend your whole life, your whole profession within one of these spheres. Now these have grown very, very large, and they have begun to be thought of as independent one from the other. You can be an important figure in the economic sphere without being an important figure in the political sphere, or an important figure in the cultural sphere. So the very fact that these areas, which you can think of in secular terms, you can think of success and failure in secular terms, have got so large in our lives, and the fact that they, unlike what they were 500 or 600 years ago, these spheres no longer have an explicit religious presence in them, which they used to have. For instance, guilds, artisan guilds in the European Middle Ages all had chaplains, they all had various kinds of rituals of inducting new members which were carried out as religious rituals and so on. Well, this no longer exists within these big spheres. So the very fact that these spheres bulk so large makes people think of a society in which they do so as secular. That's a third meaning. Incidentally, in relation to the book, that's one I added in part from reading Jose and other sociologists. I also changed the order of 1 and 2 if anybody's thinking of reading the book. So those are 3. Now let's look at 4. Here is the really difficult one to explain, and it's the one that I gave most time to in the book. Something else has changed, which is what I want to call the place of religion in our lives, in society and in individual lives, which also is something that makes people want to say our society is more secular. Now before, that's what I read. Number 4 is what I want to explain at some length, but just let me point out right away that these are different developments. And you can see that by looking at the fact that I want to claim that 4 is something that's happened in all Western societies. I'm stressing this is not a claim about this society, but 4 is something that has been happening in all Northwestern societies, let's say. But number 1, it has happened very much in some societies, much less in other societies, not at all, really. Speaking of Jose's lecture yesterday, in the USA or Poland, for instance, number 1 hasn't happened there at all. Right? So right away we see that in dealing with this strand of differences, which in a lot of discussion in the West are just lumped together as though they were all the same development, we're dealing with something much more complex, and it's partly, I mean, the handle that we've managed to get on it, I think the deeper understanding we've managed to get of this has arisen by noticing the gap between these different kinds of secularization. In addition, I mean, I want to say that the number 2, that is society which becomes religiously neutral, that's happened in a number of very different ways, right, in the West, in very different conditions. So we have something which is rather complex. Why did people fail to notice this? Why is this a surprise to some people to think about it in this way? Well, I think because we had this very simple secularization theory, where the idea was there was a set of causal relations. Modernization, the set of changes which we lump together, the rise of the modern economy, the rise of the bureaucratic state, greater mobility, large cities and so on, science, technology. Modernization brings about secularization in the sense number 1, that is, it brings about inevitably a decline in faith and practice. Decline in faith and practice facilitates number 2, that is the evacuation of religion from the public space. And then of course number 3 is thought to be just entailed by that. And number 4 is something that was off the screens of this earlier secularization theory. It was a very simple theory. Its only defect was that it was wrong. I mean, it didn't fit the facts. But it was beautifully simple, a couple of simple causal relations. Modernization produces decline of faith and practice. This facilitates the modern secular state. So if you have all those links in your mind as obvious links, you don't need to make these distinctions. It seems to be unnecessary. It's only when you see that the links don't hold that you begin to be puzzled by it. All right, so let me try now to show the importance of bringing out number 4. So perhaps number 4 is there, right. And here I should have spoken to the interpreter I'm addressing here at the moment. I have this word unbundling. Let me try to explain it. I hope that you'll find the right word for this. Things were bundled together in our past in two ways. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the situation in European societies in the 19th century and earlier, early 19th century or even middle 19th century. In the Europeans against the Americans, let's look at that case. First, these were confessional states. That is, in general, the norm was belonging to a given polity was to belong to a certain church, which was the established church or the national church. And there were some polities which had maybe two confessions, but even they, like in the Netherlands, were organized in such a way that there were two elements of society that were all organized around their faith positions. So one kind of bundling, that is one kind of connection, was that you're belonging to the state, you're belonging to your confession, you're having a certain ethic, you're having a certain idea of civilization. All that was closely linked together. It was sort of one thing. Now, there was another sense of bundling, which I also want to talk about, which was obviously causally related to the first, but wasn't exactly the same. And that is the bundling of different facets and activities within religious life. Okay, so I'm thinking now, I'm always of my own home society, Quebec, so I'm not going to be describing that, but I think something similar was true of other societies across the North Atlantic. That you have different kinds of activities. Just think of the life of a parish in Quebec in the 19th century. What's going on? Well, there are a great many things going on. There is the weekly liturgy, obviously, the central mass of the community. There are also all kinds of religious organizations, sodalities, les Enfants de Marie, and so on. And each of them has their festivals, so they're the festivals that belong to that, right? And then there are the great festivals of the year, Christmas, Easter, Corpus Christi. And then there are special activities like pilgrimages. And then there are special forms of devotion where people felt the need to develop spiritually and took on some kind of special prayer or special discipline or regular mode of devotion. These were plural. Now, these were not all undertaken by everybody, obviously. You know, some people did a lot of this and less of that and vice versa. But they were all understood as part of one single religious life. Right? They were clearly, they formed a kind of package. If you were in this world, you recognized the importance of the other things, even if you weren't doing them all the time, or most of the time. Now, these two kinds of connection together, I'm calling it bundling, come unstuck, come unbundled. In the, sometimes over a longer period, but certainly within the 20th century, and even more clearly within the second half of the 20th century. All right, so you may think that this is an oversimplification because I'm looking at Quebec and so on, and I'm looking at Europe. It's true that the situation was not the same in the United States, which had from the very beginning denominational differences and therefore plurality of positions. But this only gradually evolved into what we understand today as a secular society, because at the beginning it was understood that this was a Protestant Christian society. And the United States went through various critical moments when it had to allow that this plurality had to be extended beyond that, Catholics and Jews, then to non-believers and so on. So it was a kind of gradual evolution. And there were also the other great exception, obviously. There were movements of unbelief, of anti-religion, very powerful movements, some of them even politically successful, like in France in the Third Republic. But interestingly enough, these did not break totally with the, if you like, the formula, the template of the confessional state. That is, the attempt was rather to introduce a new, you might almost think, a new kind of state religion. This one not religious, this one lay, even atheist ideology of human rights, and to organize everything around that. I mean, the resulting history of France, for instance, for that century and a half, from 1800 until the end of the Second World War, was that of a kind of latent and sometimes not so latent civil war. People speak of la guerre franco-française, the war within France between two models of French society, one organized around the principles of the lay republic, and the other organized around the principles of Catholic monarchy, and this lasted until really the Second World War. So you can see that, and we could go on in question period, this template is still very powerful in Europe, which is one of the problems in admitting religiously pluralist societies in some Western European states today, because they have a lot of immigration from quite different Muslims and others, and the older templates still have some kind of strength, right? So this template, although it was breached in some ways, in other ways remained, except in the United States, fairly solid. In the United States, it only gradually broadened. And this, of course, is one of the reasons, as Jose has pointed out, this is one of the reasons why, and we can perhaps go into this later, why what looks like the same development on the level of 4, you can throw the 4 up there, what looks like the same development on the level of 4, or on the level of 3, produces very different results on the level of 1, that is the level of belief and practice in the society. The very fact that it happened in this long, extended way, which gave great scope to new, as it were, new developments, new invention, new explorations of spirituality in the United States, meant that the kind of pluralization which occurred was very different from the one that we see in West European societies, and had opposite effects on the level of faith and practice. We already can see the advantage of separating these out. But let me now talk about the second unbundling. The second, that is, the way in which what used to be lived, again, in extreme form perhaps in my society, the society of my childhood, the set of activities that used to be lived as part of a very tight package, now just cease to feel like that, be experienced like that, and be lived like that. The unbundling, I want to do two things here in talking about this unbundling. I'd like to look at the phenomena of, if you like, unbundled religion in the modern West, and then some of these phenomena actually extend beyond, so I will just look elsewhere. And then I want to talk about what I think drove the process in the last century in the modern West, and then we'll be able to look at the resulting situation and see, you know, what is relevant to your situation here, and so on. Well, some examples. For instance, we have in our contemporary world religion or confession as a political marker, as the marker of political allegiance, around which it can be mobilized or mobilized in forms of resistance against outsiders. But in some cases, this very strong sense of religion as a marker is unconnected from devotion, regular practice, the rites of passage. I should have mentioned that as one of the things that are bundled together in my ideal parish in Quebec, the rites of passage of baptism, marriage, funerals, and so on. So religion as a marker can become unconnected from those altogether, or unconnected from some elements of those. So you get, for instance, some Europeans today, European politicians and others who say, well, no question of inviting Turkey into the European Union. Well, why not? Well, I mean, this is a Christian civilization. No. What they mean is, it's historically that. So it's this particular confessional or religious allegiance is operating as an historical marker. That's where we came from. Those other people didn't come from there, and therefore we're going to have great trouble understanding each other with them, assimilating them, and so on. But you see, this is totally different from, let's say, another obvious example is the Polish case in which it was indeed a marker of mobilization, but it went along with that very much bundled religious life in Poland. Here it's been unbundled. It's been, or there are cases that are like that, slightly different. In a large part of Scandinavia, people massively go on belonging to the national church. They go on using the rite de passage, the rituals of passing from one stage to another, including confirmation, but if you talk to them, they say, well, this has nothing to do with faith in Jesus Christ. It's become very much the church forms have become markers of a purity, if you like, for those people, lay, or we would say secular, identity. So there is, and then you get all sorts of intermediate cases where it gets much rougher, like in the ex-Yugoslav republics, where there became really battles between different groups who were, again, identified by their historical religious markers. But in case of someone like Milosevic, who was an atheist, this is not something that is linked to Orthodox devotional life. So we get one kind of unbundling here. I think we get one aspect of what existed in the earlier religious life, spinning off without the others. And this, of course, is something that it also begins to exist outside Europe. So although the main focus has been on Europe and the West or North Atlantic, this is something that you see extending beyond. So we get another kind of phenomenon, which is modern Islamism, very strongly mobilized. Islamism mobilized against what is seen as threat from the West and so on. And this, of course, doesn't disconnect totally from all forms of devotion, but typically these movements involve a tremendous narrowing of the focus of previous religious life. They involve censoring historical Islam, excluding the Sufi element, excluding various worship of saints and so on. So you get a change, a radical change in the scope of the religion. And then another kind of change occurs where people pick up other threads or other bits of the original bundle. There are people that are very excited and drawn into the festive dimensions of Christian faith. Right? So they go on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, right? But are they Catholic? Well, not necessarily. Are they really celebrating St. James? Well, not necessarily. There's a whole gamut of cases here. Or they are very excited by, again, the festive dimension, big moments like World Youth Day, John Paul very successfully held. There again, people are drawn into that, but not necessarily to other aspects. I mean, some friends of mine who are sociologists in France tell me that there are a lot of people who are in some sense Catholic, but they're connection to the church is primarily through these festive occasions. And there may be liturgy on the occasion of these festive occasions, but they're no longer existing within a parish situation. Then there are other kinds of phenomena, which are combinations. See, interesting enough, this kind of combination of different religions, taking a bit from here and a bit from there, exists in quite different cultures. But this is nothing new in the West. In Japan, there are a lot of people who mark the birth of their child through some Shinto ritual, who are attracted to the idea of a Christian marriage and think that the burial service should be held in a Buddhist monastery. And this to them doesn't seem weird or strange. To someone trained in or brought up in the Western idea of a church as the site of all these activities, this sounds very, very strange. But now we find people are beginning to pick and choose in exactly that way. So we have these hybrids, we have new inventions, we have something that is really extraordinarily diverse. Okay, what moved this society, or these societies, from 100, 150 years ago, depending on which society, really had what I call bundled religious life within a single church, to societies which had this incredible variety. Some people opting out of religion altogether, some people bringing in religions from abroad, some people inventing new religions, some people inventing new philosophies. What moved us across the boundary line? But I think that there are really three factors that were at work here. One, and I think you can draw them together perhaps at the end to get a kind of clue to this. One is a crisis of authority in churches. That is, churches in general exercise some kind of authority, perhaps not as strong as the intent of the Catholic Church, but there are certain things that one obligatorily believes, there are certain rites that one should take part in. And there came to be a crumbling of that sense of being bound to religious authority. I mean, even among people who would go on applying to sociologists that they were Catholic or Protestant or whatever, right? So they're not denying affiliation, but the sense that the hierarchy or whatever has authority over them has dissipated. So that's one thing. But another thing, which in a way lies behind the crisis of authority, and this is particularly perhaps the case in Western Europe, but also in Quebec, is the sense of anger or dissociation because of certain specific decisions of authority. I mean, think of very recently in the Western world, the anger and indignation in many Catholic societies over the pedophilia scandals and the cover-up by the hierarchy and so on. This creates a real sense of anger, a real sense of alienation. So I might put that as number two or number 1A, in the sense it's one of the things that drives this challenge to or rejection of authority. Or I think this is particularly true in Europe and not in the United States. I believe that in Western Europe, the First World War was a real watershed. There was the sense of civilization that we are ahead of everyone else, we are moving to a higher plateau, we are in a higher ethical plane than the rest of the world, and therefore we are right to be able to rule these colonies, etc. All that sense, which was very powerful in the Edwardian era, was dealt, I think, a very deep, almost fatal blow by the spectacle of the First World War, in which you had these massive killing fields with the civilized powers grinding each other down. In each case, blessed by the church of that particular state. I think that had a tremendous effect on, anyway, sense of authority in in Europe. But there's one other factor that I put great importance on, and that I gave a central place to in the book, and that is the spread of what I want to call the ethic of authenticity. The idea that, yes, we are all human beings, and we all have to realize ourselves as human beings, but each person has their own way of being human, and we should find our own way, not simply copy someone else, not simply copy some general model that we're supposed to conform to. This, which really starts in Western Europe with the Romantic period, at the end of the 18th century, something happened in the 1960s and 70s which made this kind of ethic everywhere. You find popular references, popular culture, do your own thing, follow your own, etc. becomes universal. And I think you can, in certain societies, and Jose will correct me if this is wrong, in certain Western societies, you can correlate a very rapid falling off of belonging or participating in churches with the spread of this particular ethos. And of course in Quebec, we had all these things at once. We had the 19th century crisis of authority, and we had the 20th century authenticity at the same time. All these factors have something in common which is very hard to pin down. So I'm going to talk about something very hard to pin down. But Yves Congar, the great French Dominican theologian, who wrote some of the most important works underlying Vatican II, said way back in the 1930s, the 20th century, the 20e siècle sera un siècle de subjectivité, of subjectivity. That, in other words, there's a sense among modern people that they are agents, subjects, they're agents who have to work out what they have in themselves to say or to do. And I think he had a really profound insight, right? I mean, Congar's message was the church has to take account of this and speak to people in a different way. I think this underlies the collapse of authority, and it certainly underlies the growth of the ethic of authenticity. Right? So it was these changes, I think, which changed the religious sphere from one where the norm was, in many societies, that everybody belongs to a single church just as they are under a single authority, that kind of bundling. And in another way, they belong to a single church, which is the site of all these different activities. Right? And you get a world in which people explore not belonging at all, belonging without believing, believing without belonging, all these different formulae which break up the second bundle, in which you're into certain things and not others, perhaps none of the things that churches do, perhaps this and that churches do. And this is the world in which we now tend to exist in the West. Now, this leads to the last thing that I want to talk about here. I just mentioned it on the draft, so maybe it's a good thing that it's not up there because it would be more confusing. What I wanted to call the immanent frame. Let me try to explain what I mean by this. The immanent frame is a way of understanding our world in purely immanent terms. Positively, it consists of something of this kind. We understand our universe not in the way of the old cosmos with levels of being of the old centuries, but we understand our universe roughly in the way that modern natural science does. I mean, none of us quite understand that, quarks and these things, but we have some idea that it's a vast set of impersonal laws which govern this universe and which make it what it is. We understand the political orders in which we live as created by human consent. Every society, political society now existing in the West, can name the moment when it was refounded under some other constitution, or it changed its constitution, or what have you, so that these are seen to be structures made by human beings. If you look back earlier 3 or 4 centuries, where people thought of the legitimate structures of, let's say, the French monarchy as legitimate because they in some way reflected the cosmos, reflected the relation to God, that's out of the window. People look at the dominant political ethic of our day, which is really, in the West, the ethic of human rights, of democracy, non-discrimination, and equality. We can see that as growing through a certain number of key definitions and redefinitions. Every new constitution contains this charter. The 1948 is the Universal Declaration. We can see all that as coming about in this way, right? So that's one way of looking at the immanent frame. But what I'm trying to say is, it's not that everybody thinks that this is all you need to know or all you have to say about the universe, because there are many people, including myself, who see something beyond that, a relation to God, a relation to history, which has some kind of message for us. But the point is that although some of us may, with others, have this dimension, what we all share, what we all unquestionably share, is that immanent frame dimension. And it's that's what I call a social imaginary. And to give you another example, all of us existing in a given democratic society, well, we know that we disagree on this and on that, and I believe in this party, she believes in that party, and we're fighting for it and so on. But we share the sense that there is this constitution, we're struggling within, that's the context in which we're making these struggles, and that's something that sort of defines the space between us. Well, if you move from the constitutional, political to the cosmic, to the world in which we are, the sense of what we share in common with other human beings we live with is also this kind of immanent frame. And the particularly, I think, factor 3, that is the growth of these spheres in the economy, in administration, in government, immense spheres which are simply understood in secular terms, makes that all the more impinge all the more. We can go beyond that and say it's no longer simply a fact about the Western world, because the international structures we live in today, that everybody lives in, and the international agencies, transnational corporations, NGOs, and so on, that function within these structures are all part of the immanent sphere. And so people existing even outside the West find their lives impinged upon when transnationals come in, when et cetera, by a sort of larger immanent sphere of the whole world. Now, let's try to now connect this, the power of that immanent sphere, with religion, with religious responses to it. As I said earlier, nothing forces you logically moving from the immanent sphere, is what we all share, to I don't have anything further to say here, or I don't believe anything further is to be said here. Not at all. There's no logical connection there. And there's not even a psychological connection, because for a lot of people, there's a very powerful sense that they have of their need for some religious faith, or their commitment to some religious faith, easily allows them within this world to carry out that faith. But I want to try to connect this immanent sphere with different ways of living it. And we can maybe try to ask ourselves why some of these ways are more important in some places than in others. And here's where we come back crucially to the original definition of the secular as a notion about time. I think you could say that the way of operating within these large bureaucratic or economic structures, within our science, technology, the way of operating encourages a certain way of inhabiting time, or you might almost say a certain way of not inhabiting time. In order to see this, let's look back again to the past at ways in which, for people, what they then would have called also in West, secular time wasn't the whole story. It wasn't the whole story because there were other kinds of higher time that they recognized. For instance, there's a time of kairos, of the kairotic time, the time at a moment when everything turns and changes because of certain key developments which send history off in a new direction. There is a kind of higher time, for the time in which certain moments of our salvation occurred, in the case of the life of Christ for Christians, but in all sorts of other societies there are notions of original time in which the present world was founded, and these are higher times than just the ordinary moments of secular time we live in. And then there are these strange kinds of propinquities within secular time because of higher time. That is, when we go on a pilgrimage or a high festival and we reach our goal and we finally have whatever liturgy we have, the whole sense here, which still today the whole sense, but it was formerly shared by everyone, is that we're somehow getting closer to these higher moments. When we celebrate Easter, we're getting closer to that original Easter than we are, we're in some way closer to the original Easter than we are to last week almost. So that the primacy of secular time, which is a kind of democracy of moments where each moment is of equal value, each moment is no more important than another moment, everything is on the same footing. The priority of secular time, profane time, was profoundly breached in the religious consciousness of earlier days. Well, now we have in our secular world, because of the immanent frame, a very powerful sense of the great importance of secular time. It is, and indeed, a kind of consciousness of time in which, in a certain sense, we rise beyond time, but in a very special way in modern science and technology. We rise beyond time by objectifying time. So we can lay out the whole development of history, or the whole development of certain processes as occurring in secular time. Lay it out in order to understand it, in order to be able to intervene in it and change it. And it's this objectified time which is the way we relate to time so much of the time, so much of our lives. We relate to it via objectifying it. So much so that you can see, precisely this modern period, rebellions against that. You can see this in our philosophy and our literature. It's very interesting. Rebellions against this objectified take on time. In the name of what? In the name of lived time. So you think of philosophers, there's Bergson, there's Heidegger, right? Which are philosophers who are working against the primacy of objectified time. Or the extraordinary case, I mentioned these moments, these sense we have that sometimes two moments very far apart are very close together, right? Because as we celebrate Easter and the original Easter are brought closer together, even though they're very far apart in profane time. Well, in the work of Marcel Proust, you get such extraordinary connections across time, and it's part of the tremendous power of that work, I think. Really marks the 20th century literature. You get these moments of le temps retrouvé in which the connection is made across vast parts of secular time. So secular time isn't the last word. But now, if we come to the religious consciousness, to what extent are we satisfied, can we be satisfied with living time in this objectified way? Well, if we're very much into we're very excited by the idea of controlling our history, of controlling the world, of changing things and ordering them, then this will be a very exciting prospect. And it's possible to combine that with a very strong moral set of principles. I mean, we want to control the world and organize it precisely because we want to make one realize certain moral principles which are otherwise being neglected or violated. Right? So we have this one way of being very excited by that. But in all sorts of other ways, you find that this is deeply unsatisfying to people. And it's really there that you can see the continuing impulse to relate in another way. There's a revolt against this kind of objectified notion of time by people who are deeply perturbed by our relationship to nature as simply controlling it, all the dangers of that, all the violence it does to us as human beings in our proper nature. You can see a whole ecological dimension of the rebellion against the primacy of this objectified time. So people living in the immanent frame, exactly, but with that sense, they are stimulated to go beyond the immanent frame. The immanent frame produces in them exactly the opposite reaction from the one of people that are very excited by the idea of control. It produces in them the desire to go beyond this, to understand something more, and so on. So there's the ecological movement. There are various movements which take the moral side of those who want to remake the world, humanitarian side of it, and are deeply perturbed by certain aspects of it. That is, by ways in which this objectified approach doesn't really take account of the human particularity of the people that are supposed to be beneficiaries, or the way that it doesn't, as it were, invite these people in to co-determine the various humanitarian acts. And we always find that, regularly, that our humanitarian impulses can be deviated by various bureaucratic and other structures, right? So there are people that are deeply disturbed by that. And then there are people who are very much dissatisfied, because what they're looking for is some kind of possibility, some kind of direction of personal, and I would say also personal transformation. That is, they have a sense that they could be much more understanding, much more open, much more loving, much more giving than they are, and they don't find any root to this in the picture of a controlled world. It's not the controlled world, it's something to do with their own growth. Now it's in that area that you find regularly that people emerge out of the immanent frame, or emerge into and are drawn into different faith positions. In a sense of all the bundle of different activities that have now been unbundled, those which were related to devotion to spiritual growth are in some ways the ones that recur again and again. And you find in whole societies that are living in the international immanent frame, big religious changes going on by people who are looking for some kind of personal transformation. So you get these big movements of conversion to Christianity, various new forms of Buddhism in Korea and Taiwan. Of course, the tremendous phenomenon of Pentecostalism across so many different societies. Pentecostalism is also a response to that objectifying control of time. See, Pentecostalist movements privilege this moment of eruption into time of the Spirit, right? That's what you see in various parts of the world, not only Protestant Pentecostalism, but Catholic Pentecostalism, where if you like, the whole parish becomes more alive and awake, because there's a kind of, and we were seeing some of this in Brazil over last month, because there is this sense of the singing and the chanting of the Spirit coming into their lives now. And once again, see, they're So what I'm trying to say is we have this immanent frame which has emerged from this fragmentation, if you like, of formerly bundled religion, but it doesn't at all spell the end of religion. It does, under certain circumstances. You can see why it can look very motivating to some people if they're excited by the possibilities, but in all sorts of other ways, in ways that are to do with either what we understand as traditional religions, and in other ways again, or in ways that mix these traditional understandings with other understandings of ecological, the sense of spirit erupting, the sense of personal transformation. We have people struggling to get beyond this. So the immanent frame we live in is a profoundly ambivalent, profoundly multivalent phenomenon. And I think here's where I'm going to stop because I can't go farther. But I could imagine our looking at this more closely and understanding better why, in some cases, this frame is responded to by very vibrant religious renewal or religious new forms, and in other cases is responded to as normal, it's the way things are, you can't challenge it. If we had some greater understanding of that, we would be, I think, in a much better situation, and I feel that we're, as we move forward, we're on the brink of it. So thank you very, very much for your attention, and you see why I really need, we all need your feedback here. Thank you.